You should marry my sister.
The Duke of Ashbourne was hiding behind a wilting rhododendron bush when a sticky, jam-covered hand tugged hard at his trousers. "You should marry my sister," a little girl said, entirely unprompted. It wasn't the worst marriage proposal he'd received that season, but it was certainly the most terrifying. The mid-July heat was entirely unforgiving, pressing down on Lady Whitmore's garden party like a damp, suffocating wool blanket. Sebastian Croft, the Duke of Ashbourne, stood near the edge of the manicured lawn, acutely aware of the sweat pooling at the base of his spine. His cravat, tied with impeccable, agonizing precision by his valet that morning, felt like a slow-moving garrote. Around him, the air reeked of crushed lavender, overheated bodies, and the sharp, metallic tang of desperation. He took a sip of warm, flat champagne and let his eyes drift over the sprawling estate. The lawn was dotted with silk parasols and brightly colored muslin gowns, a swirling sea of pastels that made his head ache. A string quartet scraped away in the distance, the cellist half a beat behind the violins. It was the peak of the London season, transplanted to the countryside for the weekend, and Sebastian was drowning in it. He was 32, wealthy, and untitled enough to make him the prime target for every ambitious matriarch within a 100-mile radius. He had spent the last 2 hours dodging thinly veiled inquiries about the square footage of his ancestral home and the fertility history of his female relatives. He didn't feel like a man, he felt like a prize bull being paraded at a country fair. To escape a particularly aggressive widow wielding a fan like a weapon, Sebastian had retreated to the periphery of the gardens, wedging himself between a stone birdbath and a massive, overgrown rhododendron bush. It wasn't dignified, but it was quiet. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the rough bark of a nearby oak tree, listening to the drone of a fat bumblebee hovering near his shoulder. Then came the sharp, uncompromising yank on the fabric of his trousers. Sebastian's eyes snapped open. He looked down, expecting a stray dog or perhaps a particularly bold goose. Instead, he found a child. She was perhaps 7 years old, though her scowl belonged to an exhausted dock worker. Her white dress, likely pristine an hour ago, was now smeared with grass stains at the knees and something dark and crimson down the front. A crushed strawberry tart was clutched in her left fist, oozing red jam between her knuckles. She stared up at him with unblinking, pale blue eyes, her chin tipped back in challenge. "You're ruining your coat against that tree," she observed. Her voice was surprisingly gravelly for her size. Sebastian blinked, thrown off balance. He looked at the bark, then back at the girl. "I imagine my tailor will recover from the tragedy," he said dryly. The girl didn't smile. She took a slow, deliberate bite of her mangled tart. A fresh drop of jam fell onto the toe of Sebastian's polished hessians. He watched it land, feeling a strange, detached numbness. He could summon his terrifying ducal glare, the one that made grown men stammer in Parliament, but something told him it would be entirely wasted on a creature currently chewing with her mouth open. "You're the Duke," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Sebastian replied, shifting his weight. His boots pinched at the toes. "And you are an exceptionally messy child." "I'm Beatrice," she countered, wiping her sticky mouth with the back of her wrist, spreading the red stain closer to her ear. "And you should marry my sister." The words hung in the humid air, suspended between the buzzing of the bee and the distant agonizing screech of the cello. Sebastian stared at her. He had been cornered by sobbing mothers. He had been ambushed in drawing rooms. He had received perfumed letters detailing dowries and dental histories, but no one had ever pitched a marriage to him while leaking pastry filling onto his boots. A short, genuine laugh barked out of his chest before he could stop it. It scratched his dry throat. "Is that right?" he asked, crouching down slightly so he didn't have to crane his neck. The sudden movement made his left knee pop. "Has your sister sent you to negotiate on her behalf?" "I must warn you, my bridal requirements are quite stringent. I demand at least 2 unbroken front teeth." Beatrice bared her teeth. She was missing a lateral incisor. "Clara has all her teeth. She's old. She's 21. Ancient," Sebastian agreed solemnly, practically dusting away to powder. "Why, pray tell, should I marry this elderly woman?" Beatrice considered the question, tilting her head. She didn't look at him with the starry-eyed reverence children usually reserve for titles, nor the calculated greed of the aristocracy. She looked at him like he was a slightly dim-witted horse she was trying to evaluate for a cart. "Because you look miserable," Beatrice said bluntly, "and Clara is miserable. And if you marry her, she gets to leave our aunt's house, and I get to come with her, and we don't have to go to these stupid parties anymore where the lemonade tastes like soap." It was the most brutally honest thing Sebastian had heard in 6 months. It hit him in the chest, hard and uncomfortable. There were no platitudes about his handsome profile or his vast estates, just a raw transactional observation of his own palpable misery. He looked away from the girl, his gaze drifting back toward the pastel sea of the lawn. He was miserable. He felt hollowed out, performing a pantomime of a gentleman while feeling entirely disconnected from the human race. "Your sister hates the lemonade too?" Sebastian asked, his voice losing its mocking edge. "She hates everything today," Beatrice clarified, shoving the last of the tart into her mouth. "Her shoes are too tight, and a man with sweaty hands tried to dance with her. She's hiding." Sebastian felt a sudden, sharp spike of kinship. A man with sweaty hands, tight shoes, hiding. Clara, whoever she was, sounded like the only sane person within the county lines. "And where is the ancient tooth-retaining Clara hiding?" Sebastian found himself asking before his brain could catch up with his mouth. He didn't want a wife. He barely wanted a conversation. But the crushing boredom of the rhododendron bush suddenly felt worse than the prospect of following a sticky child into the unknown. Beatrice swallowed audibly, her pale eyes narrowing. She extended her clean hand, the right one, toward him. "I'll show you, but you have to walk quietly. She bites when she's startled." Sebastian did not take the little girl's hand. He valued his gloves too much for that. Instead, he gestured for Beatrice to lead the way, following her small, stomping form deeper into the overgrown, neglected rear gardens of the Whitmore estate. As they walked away from the manicured lawns, the oppressive heat began to break, shaded by ancient, twisting elm trees and thick tangles of ivy. The smell of cloying perfume faded, replaced by the damp, earthy scent of rotting leaves and wet soil. It was cooler here, the light filtering through the canopy in fragmented, dusty beams. Sebastian let out a long breath, rolling his shoulders to ease the tension in his back. The gravel crunched under his boots, a rhythmic, grounding sound. He watched Beatrice march ahead of him. She dragged a stick along the wrought iron fencing, creating a hollow, clattering racket that entirely contradicted her earlier instruction to walk quietly. Sebastian didn't correct her. He was too busy cataloging the absurdity of his own actions. He was a duke of the realm, trailing behind a 7-year-old covered in jam to ambush a woman who was actively hiding from society. It was mortifying. It was deeply inappropriate. It was the most alive he had felt in a year. "She's in the old greenhouse," Beatrice threw over her shoulder, not breaking her stride. "She says it smells like dead things, but no one ever goes in there." "Charming," Sebastian muttered. They rounded a bend in the path, and the skeletal remains of a Victorian glasshouse loomed into view. Half the panes were shattered, the iron framework rusted to a dull, flaking orange. Thick vines of ivy had swallowed the northern wall, crawling through the broken glass like grasping fingers. It did, indeed, look like a place where things went to die. Beatrice stopped at the arched entrance and pointed a sticky finger inside. "She's in there. Don't tell her I sent you, or she won't let me have any pudding tonight." Before Sebastian could agree to the terms, Beatrice turned and sprinted back down the path, her white dress flashing through the green shadows until she vanished entirely. Sebastian stood alone at the entrance of the greenhouse. He could turn back. He should turn back. He was a man of logic, of ledgers and parliamentary speeches. Wandering into a ruined glass house to solicit a stranger bordered on madness. He rested his hand on the rusted iron frame. It was rough and warm under his leather glove. He stepped inside. The air in the greenhouse was thick, heavy with the scent of damp moss and old earth. It was quieter here, the screeching strings of the quartet entirely swallowed by the glass and stone. Sebastian walked softly, his boots scuffing against the moss-slicked paving stones. He found her near the back, sitting on an overturned, cracked ceramic planter. Sebastian stopped, perfectly still, He didn't know what he had expected. Perhaps a weeping wallflower, or a dramatic, tragic beauty bemoaning her fate to the heavens. Clara was neither. She was currently engaged in a violent, whispered argument with her own left shoe. "Insolent, vicious little trap," she hissed, her voice a low, raspy alto that scraped pleasantly against Sebastian's ears. She had her knee pulled up to her chest, her skirt bunched unceremoniously around her thighs, entirely disregarding modesty. She was yanking at the heel of a delicate satin slipper with a ferocity that threatened to tear the fabric in two. Sebastian simply watched. She was not classically beautiful. Her hair, a dark, muddy brown, was escaping its elaborate updo in a dozen different directions, sticking to the sweat on the back of her neck. Her gown was a dull, washed-out primrose yellow that did absolutely nothing for her pale complexion. She looked exhausted, irritable, and wonderfully ordinary. She gave the shoe one final, vicious wrench. It popped off her foot, flying out of her hands and skittering across the stone floor to hit the toe of Sebastian's boot with a soft thud. Clara froze. She didn't scream. She didn't gasp. She slowly, agonizingly lowered her bare, stocking-clad foot to the floor and turned her head toward him. Her eyes were dark, ringed with the faint, bruised shadows of chronic exhaustion. For a long second, they just stared at each other. The silence stretched, heavy and awkward. Sebastian felt a drop of sweat roll down his ribs beneath his heavy coat. He should apologize. He should bow, avert his eyes, offer some polite fiction about losing his way. Instead, he looked down at the satin slipper resting against his boot. He nudged it gently with his toe. "You seem to have lost a battle with your footwear," Sebastian said, his voice flat, devoid of any gentlemanly polish. Clara's jaw tightened. A flush of dark red crept up her neck, disappearing into the roots of her messy hair, but her gaze didn't drop. She didn't scramble to fix her skirts. She just glared at him, a raw, defensive hostility radiating from her tense shoulders. "It was an assassination attempt," Clara replied, her voice trembling slightly, though whether from anger or mortification, Sebastian couldn't tell. "The shoemaker is clearly in the employ of my enemies." Sebastian felt the corner of his mouth twitch. It was a microscopic movement, but it felt monumental. "And who are your enemies?" "Currently?" Clara asked, narrowing her eyes at his immaculate coat and perfectly tied cravat. "Men who wear coats that cost more than my aunt's carriage, who sneak into ruined greenhouses to gawk at women trying to preserve their toes." It was a direct hit. It lacked the simpering politeness of the drawing room. It was combative, prickly, and deeply defensive. Sebastian felt a strange magnetic pull. She wasn't trying to impress him. She actively wanted him to leave. "I wasn't sneaking," Sebastian defended himself, though the lie tasted weak on his tongue. "I was directed here." Clara went very still. The hostile fire in her eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden, dawning horror. She swallowed, her throat working visibly. "Directed," she repeated, the words sounding hollow. She closed her eyes for a brief, painful second. When she opened them, the anger was gone, leaving behind a brittle, bone-deep weariness. Was it a little girl? Missing a tooth? Looking like she was dragged backward through a briar patch? With a disturbing affinity for strawberry jam, Sebastian confirmed. Clara let out a breath that sounded like a tire deflating. She dropped her forehead into her hands, her fingers digging into her messy hair. "Oh, God," she muttered into her palms. "I am going to strangle her. I am going to murder my only sister and bury her under the petunias." She looked up at him, her face a mask of utter humiliation. The bravado was completely stripped away, leaving a vulnerable, exhausted woman in a cheap yellow dress. "Please," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Whatever she said to you, just forget it. I apologize for her. She doesn't understand how the world works." Sebastian looked at Clara. He looked at her bare foot, her ruined hair, the dark circles under her eyes. He thought of the suffocating party behind them, the endless ledgers, the sweaty hands, the tight shoes. He took a step forward, the gravel grinding loudly under his heel. "She understands perfectly," Sebastian said quietly. "She told me we were both miserable. Was she wrong?" Clara stared at him. The silence in the ruined greenhouse stretched, thick and stifling, broken only by the distant, muffled scrape of a violin and the erratic buzzing of a horsefly trapped against a dirty pane of glass. She looked at his immaculate, broad-shouldered coat, the severe, aristocratic lines of his jaw, and the casual arrogance of his stance. Then she laughed. It was not a pretty sound. It was a harsh, dry bark that scraped the back of her throat, entirely devoid of amusement. It sounded like a dead branch snapping underfoot. "Miserable," Clara repeated, the word dripping with a heavy, caustic disbelief. She unclasped her arms from around her knees and leaned forward, pointing a bare, stocking toe toward him. "You are the Duke of Ashbourne. You own half of Derbyshire. You arrived at this suffocating party in a carriage lined with velvet, and you will leave whenever you please. You do not know the first thing about being miserable." Sebastian didn't flinch. He absorbed the venom in her voice, noting the way her hands shook slightly where they gripped the rough edge of the ceramic planter. She was terrified of him, he realized. Terrified of his title, of his presence, of the power he held simply by existing in the same room as her compromised, shoeless self. He looked around the greenhouse. There was an overturned, rotting wooden crate a few feet from her. Slowly, deliberately, Sebastian walked over to it. He didn't check it for dirt. He didn't carefully part his coattails to preserve the fabric. He simply sat down, the ancient wood groaning under his weight, the damp rot immediately seeping into the worsted wool of his trousers. Clara's mouth parted in shock. Her eyes dropped to his ruined trousers, then darted back up to his face. "My misery is different from yours," Sebastian said, resting his elbows on his knees, bringing himself closer to her eye level. The heat in the greenhouse was oppressive, and he could feel a bead of sweat tracing a slow, itchy path down his spine. "Yours is sharp. It is tight shoes and sweaty hands and the terror of being a burden to an aunt who clearly despises you." Clara flinched, her spine snapping straight. "You know nothing of my aunt." "I know the type," Sebastian countered softly. "I have spent the last decade trapped in drawing rooms with hundreds of them. They smell of mothballs and resentment. They tally your worth in ledgers of lineage and dowry, and if you fall short, they make sure you bleed for the bread you eat." He saw her throat work. She looked away, her jaw clenching so hard he could see the muscle twitching beneath her pale skin. The fight drained out of her, leaving behind that brittle, bone-deep weariness Beatrice had described so perfectly. "And what is your misery, your grace?" Clara asked to the crumbling brick wall. Her voice was flat, devoid of its earlier heat. "Are your estates too vast? Is the velvet in your carriage chafing?" "Boredom," Sebastian answered with brutal honesty. "A crushing, paralyzing boredom that makes me wonder if I have actually died and am simply haunting my own life." Clara turned her head back to him, her brows furrowed in genuine confusion. "I am a commodity," he explained, his voice low, scraping against the damp air. "I am not a man to anyone out there. I am a title. I am a bank vault. Every conversation is a calculation. Every smile is a trap. I cannot sneeze without a mother shoving her daughter forward with a handkerchief and a marriage contract." He leaned back, the wood creaking again. "I spend my days managing estates I barely see, voting on laws I care nothing about. To preserve a legacy for a theoretical heir I have no desire to produce. It is a slow, quiet asphyxiation." Clara studied him. The hostility was gone, replaced by a cautious, analytical stillness. She looked at his hands, encased in soft leather gloves, and then up at the rigid, perfect knot of his cravat. "So," she said slowly, picking at a loose thread on the hem of her cheap yellow gown, "we are a trapped rat and a suffocating bird." Sebastian felt that microscopic twitch at the corner of his mouth again. An apt, if unpoetic, summary. "And Beatrice thinks the solution is to put the rat and the bird in the same cage." Clara shook her head, a heavy, exhausted sigh escaping her lips. "She is an idiot. A sticky, loud, wonderful idiot. She is observant." "She is 7, Clara snapped, though there was no real anger in it. She reached down and rubbed her bare foot, her thumb pressing into the angry red welt where the shoe had dug into her heel. "If I am caught here alone with you, my aunt will not just make me bleed. She will turn me out. I will be ruined, and Beatrice will be left alone with her. The stark reality of her situation hit Sebastian like a physical blow. He had the luxury of complaining about boredom. She was fighting for survival. The societal rules that merely chafed him were the very things that could destroy her. "Then we must ensure you are not caught," Sebastian said, his voice dropping into the cool, authoritative register he used in Parliament. It wasn't an emotional comfort. It was a tactical pivot. Clara let out a small, pathetic sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Unless you possess a cloak of invisibility, Your Grace, I am entirely out of options. I cannot walk back across the lawn with one shoe, and I cannot force that torturous device back onto my foot." She gestured toward the discarded satin slipper resting near Sebastian's boot. It looked tiny, fragile, and utterly inadequate for the gravel paths of the estate. Sebastian looked at the shoe, then at Clara's foot, swollen and red. He felt a sudden, illogical surge of anger toward the shoemaker, toward her aunt, toward the entire rigid structure of the world outside this glass house. He stood up. His knees popped again, louder this time. He ignored it. He stepped over to the slipper, bent down, and picked it up. It weighed nothing. It was a useless decorative prison. "What are you doing?" Clara asked, her voice hitching with fresh panic. She pulled her knee tighter to her chest, a purely defensive posture. Sebastian didn't answer. He walked the few steps to her ceramic planter and knelt on the dirty, moss-covered floor. The gravel dug sharply through the fabric of his ruined trousers, pressing into his kneecaps. "Give me your foot!" he commanded. Clara stared down at him, her eyes wide, the bruised shadows beneath them stark in the dim light. "You must be mad." "Give me your foot, Clara," he repeated, using her name for the first time. It felt strange on his tongue. Heavy, real. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Then, with a slow, jerky movement, she extended her leg. Sebastian took her heel in his hand. Through his leather glove, he could feel the radiating heat of her skin, the slight dampness of sweat on her cotton stocking, and the rigid tension in her muscles. Her foot was small, but it felt solid, grounded, entirely unlike the fragile porcelain dolls he was used to dancing with. He didn't look up at her face. He kept his eyes focused on the task, treating it with the cold precision of a surgeon. He angled the satin slipper, pressing it against her toes. Clara hissed through her teeth as the stiff fabric caught on the red welt. "It won't fit," she whispered, her voice tight with pain. "My foot has swelled in the heat." "It will fit," Sebastian said, his voice flat. He gripped her ankle with his left hand, holding it steady, and used his right to force the heel of the shoe over her skin. It was an ugly, ungraceful struggle. There was no Cinderella magic here. It was just brute force, the ugly scrape of satin against a blister, and the sharp, shallow breaths of a woman trying not to cry out. Sebastian pushed. Clara dug her fingernails into the edge of the ceramic planter. With a sickening, soft, popping sound, the heel slid into place. Clara immediately tried to yank her foot back, but Sebastian held on for a second longer. He felt a tremor run through her leg, a physical manifestation of her exhaustion and pain. He released her ankle slowly, letting his hands fall to his sides. He remained kneeling on the gravel, the dirt grinding into his kneecaps. He looked up. Clara's eyes were bright, with unshed tears. Her lower lip caught hard between her teeth. She looked furious, humiliated, and entirely defeated. She looked away, refusing to meet his gaze, staring instead at the rusted iron framing of the greenhouse roof. "Thank you," she choked out, the words sounding like ground glass. Before Sebastian could reply, a voice sliced through the heavy, damp air. "Clara! Clara! Where are you hiding, you insolent girl?" The voice was shrill, carrying the unmistakable cadence of aristocratic fury. It was coming from the gravel path leading toward the greenhouse. It was close. Clara went entirely rigid. The blood drained from her face, leaving her a sickly ash-gray color. She scrambled to stand, her left foot touching the ground before she immediately gasped and buckled, the pain of the forced shoe too much to bear. Sebastian stood up, catching her by the elbow before she could hit the floor. Her arm felt thin beneath the cheap muslin of her sleeves. She was trembling violently. "My aunt," Clara whispered, her eyes wide with a blind, panicked terror. She looked around the ruined glasshouse, searching for an exit that didn't exist. She'll find me here. With you. I'll be ruined. She'll cast me out. Breathe, Sebastian ordered quietly. I can't, she gasped, her hands flying up to grip the lapels of his coat. It was an entirely inappropriate liberty, completely forbidden by every rule of polite society, but she was holding on to him like a drowning sailor to a piece of driftwood. You have to leave. Hide behind the ivy. I'll go out. I'll say, I was alone. You cannot walk, Sebastian pointed out brutally. He looked down at her hands on his chest. Her knuckles were white. He felt a strange, solid heaviness settle in his stomach. The paralyzing boredom was gone, completely eradicated. Clara. The shrill voice was louder now. The crunch of gravel echoed just outside the arched entrance. I know you are in there. Lord help me when I find you. Mrs. Linfield stepped into the doorway of the greenhouse. She was a large woman, tightly corseted into a gown of dark plum silk that rustled aggressively with every movement. She stopped dead, her mouth dropping open, her small, sharp eyes locked onto the scene before her. Clara let out a small, broken sound and tried to pull her hands away from Sebastian's coat. Sebastian didn't let her. He closed his large, gloved hands over her small, trembling ones, holding them firmly against his chest. He turned his head slowly, leveling his gaze at the older woman. He summoned the Duke. It was a persona he usually despised, a cold, unyielding mask of absolute authority and terrifying entitlement. He let it drop over his features now, his eyes turning to chips of ice, his posture rigid and commanding. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't stammer or apologize. He simply stared at Mrs. Linfield, daring her to speak. The silence in the greenhouse was absolute, suffocating. Mrs. Linfield's face cycled through a rapid series of colors, pasty white, flushed pink, and finally a deep, mottled purple. She looked at Clara's disheveled hair, her ruined dress, the way her hands were pressed against the Duke's chest. Your Grace, Mrs. Linfield finally managed to choke out, her voice dropping an octave in sheer, unadulterated shock. She executed a jerky, uncoordinated curtsy, the plum silk screaming in protest. I did not realize you were occupied. You are intruding, madam, Sebastian said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a deadly, resonant weight. It was the voice that ended careers in the House of Lords. Mrs. Linfield flinched as if struck. I apologize, Your Grace. I was merely searching for my niece. She is prone to wandering. The woman's eyes darted to Clara, filled with a sudden, calculating venom. She was already writing the narrative, Sebastian knew. The ruined niece, the scandalous affair. Clara swayed slightly against him. He tightened his grip on her hands. He had a choice to make. He could walk away. He could let go of her hands, offer a polite, meaningless apology to the aunt, and return to the party. Clara would be destroyed, but he would remain untouched. The armor of his title would protect him, just as it always did. He looked down at Clara. She wasn't looking at her aunt. She was looking at his coat, her eyes vacant, waiting for the blow to fall. She was waiting for him to leave. She expected it. Your niece is not wandering, Sebastian stated flatly, his eyes locking back onto Mrs. Linfield. She is exactly where I asked her to be. Clara's head snapped up, her breath catching in her throat. Indeed? Mrs. Linfield squeaked, her calculating gaze faltering. Indeed. Sebastian let go of Clara's hands, but he didn't step away. Instead, he shifted his weight, placing himself slightly in front of her, effectively shielding her from her aunt's line of sight. It was a possessive, territorial movement. He looked at Mrs. Linfield, feeling the cold, hard logic of his miserable life finally click into place. Beatrice had presented a transaction. He was simply executing it. I was seeking a moment of privacy to speak with Clara, Sebastian lied, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. I intend to call upon your house tomorrow morning, Mrs. Linfield. Have your solicitor present. We have the terms of a marriage settlement to discuss. Mrs. Linfield's mouth opened and closed silently, resembling a landed trout grasping for air. The furious purple of her face slowly receded into a pallid, calculating sheen. A duke, a marriage settlement. The sudden elevation of her ruined niece to a duchess was a social coup that would cement her status for a decade. She swallowed her outrage, executed a creaking curtsy, and began backing away. "Tomorrow morning, Your Grace," she managed, her voice thick with an oily forced deference. "We shall expect you." She turned and hurried down the gravel path, the frantic rustle of her plum silk fading into the drone of the distant string quartet. Sebastian stood perfectly still. The stifling heat of the greenhouse crashed back down on him. He unclasped his hands, feeling the slick, uncomfortable dampness of sweat against his palms inside his leather gloves. He turned slowly to look at Clara. She stood with her weight shifted heavily onto her uninjured right foot, her chest rising and falling in shallow jerks. She stared at the empty doorway, her face an unreadable mask of absolute shock. "Well," Sebastian said, his voice deliberately flat, cutting through the silence, "that went reasonably well, all things considered." Clara snapped her gaze to him. The shock was instantly burned away by a feral wave of anger. "Are you insane?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with panic. She took a step toward him, wincing as the stiff satin slipper dug into her blister. She ignored it, limping forward until she was mere inches from his chest. "A marriage settlement? Do you think this is a game?" Sebastian didn't step back. He looked down into her dark, furious eyes. The heavy smell of rotting earth and damp moss hung thick between them, grounding the moment in a dirty, undeniable reality. "I assure you, I have never been more serious," he replied smoothly. "You just bound yourself to a woman you met 10 minutes ago." Clara grabbed his sleeve, her fingernails digging fiercely into the fine wool. "To save me from a scolding. My aunt will drag you through the courts if you try to withdraw. You have ruined your life out of some misguided sense of pity." Sebastian looked at her hand, clutching his arm. He felt a strange, solid pressure expand in his chest. It wasn't pity. Pity was a copper coin tossed to a beggar. What he felt right now was the heavy, iron drop of an anchor into the turbulent ocean of his own apathy. "I do not pity you, Clara," he said, keeping his voice low. "I told you, I need a wife. It is a biological and societal requirement of my title. If I walk back out onto that lawn alone, I will spend the next 3 years being hunted by women who view me as a bank vault." He gently detached her trembling fingers from his sleeve, holding her hand for a brief second before letting it drop. "You, on the other hand," Sebastian continued, stepping back slightly, "do not simper. You possess a terrifying younger sister who will undoubtedly keep my staff on their toes, and you appear to loathe polite society just as much as I do. It is a mutually beneficial arrangement." Clara stared at him. The defensive anger drained from her shoulders, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. She rubbed her forehead, smudging a faint streak of gray dirt across her pale temple. "You are buying me," she stated, her voice hollow. "You are buying a quiet life, and I am the purchase." "I am proposing a partnership," Sebastian corrected. "I provide an immediate escape from your aunt and financial security for your sister. You provide me with a companion who does not expect a romantic hero, and who will not complain when I spend a month reading in my library without speaking." He watched her process the cold transactional offer. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a contract forged in a ruined greenhouse, built on mutual desperation. Clara looked down at her feet. The tight satin slipper throbbed an agonizing beat against her heel. She thought of the cold tea, the endless reprimands, the terrified look in Beatrice's pale eyes. Then she looked back up at the Duke. His expensive trousers were permanently stained with green moss at the knees. He didn't look like a gleaming savior. He looked tired, cynical, and utterly honest. "Beatrice requires a great deal of jam," Clara said, her voice gravelly and raw. Sebastian felt a genuine, unforced smile crack the rigid lines of his face. "I own several farms," he replied. "We can dedicate one entirely to strawberry production." Clara let out a short, wet breath that might have been a laugh. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, abandoning societal grace entirely. "My foot is bleeding," she announced bluntly. "I am aware," Sebastian said. He stepped forward and offered his arm, the heavy worsted wool rough and solid. Lean on me. We will walk slowly. If your aunt has sent scouts, we must look the part of a deeply devoted couple." Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second. She looked at his offered arm, then up at his face, the cynical Duke and the limping wallflower. She reached out and looped her arm firmly through his, letting her weight settle against his side. He was warm and rock steady against the uneven gravel. "If you step on my good foot," Clara warned, her voice regaining a tiny fraction of its bite, "I will shove you into the rhododendron bush." "Noted," Sebastian said. They turned toward the arched doorway. The oppressive heat of the July afternoon waited for them, alongside the screeching cellist, the pastel crowds, and a future neither of them had expected. They walked out together, moving slowly into the glare of the sun. If you enjoyed this raw, unconventional historical romance, please hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a story where the characters are beautifully, painfully flawed. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell for more deeply human, grounded storytelling. Leave a comment below. Would you have accepted the Duke's pragmatic proposal, or would you have shoved him into the rhododendrons? Let me know your thoughts, and stay tuned for our next video.